welcome back here to Bonn. I'm pleased to say that we've been joined by Tasneem Essop from WWF, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the road to Cancun and progress. We've had a couple of speakers in this morning about this, talking about the role of Saudi Arabia and the oil countries blocking the talks here. I don't know if you want to make a short comment on that first, because it seems to have changed the tone here. But hopefully, there's still room for progress, and we'll come out of these talks and move forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Saudi blocking the review, the 1.5 degree review proposal yesterday was a really sad moment. I mean, up to then, it seems as if in this round of negotiations, the atmosphere has changed somewhat. It's been a bit more positive and a bit more constructive, and that could lay the basis for some serious work getting done. So that is a turning point, to have the Saudis blocking it. I think that the upside of it is, if there can be an upside to blocking such a critical thing, is that it was in fact a very, very few isolated countries who stood behind Saudi in the blocking, and that there's a growing consensus and a growing unity amongst all the other countries. So clearly there could be the opportunity to build momentum from a much wider consensus, a much wider group of parties who do want to be constructive, and very clearly isolating the very few who clearly do not want progress. So it becomes a bit more clearer. I think the tone might change. We still have to look for that. And then, of course, we're hoping to get the chair's text come out again. They had promised by this evening. And whether that will become a non-paper or will be agreed to as a negotiating text is something we will have to see the parties respond to by tomorrow, hopefully. And if we do leave with that piece of work as a homework, or as we would call it in WWF, the souvenir for August, then we would need to get parties into line-by-line negotiation by the August session. I need to remind ourselves that we actually only have 2 weeks of negotiation left. The one in August in Bonn, and then we have the October session, also a 1-week session in China. That's 2 weeks for negotiations before Cancun. So we've got a lot of work to do.
So you mentioned this text which the chair is working on, and we've been kind of using that as a benchmark for success of this conference, and I think that a lot of the different NGOs have been saying that we really have to get a text out of here, so a new basis for negotiation in order to move these talks forward. And initially we were hoping for something to come out maybe at the start of the first week, and now a little bit later, and now there's talk of it being a non-paper. And I guess what do we really need now? What's the absolute minimum we're hoping for, and what's the way forward from that?
Well, the minimum coming out of Bonn would be a negotiating text. We want parties to agree to the proposed text as a basis for negotiation in August. So if parties are starting to talk about a non-paper, then that would be worrying. I think there's a number of parties, however, that would want to see the result of this Bonn session as the negotiating text that they can take home with and come to the Bonn session for negotiation. So we'll have to see how that plays itself out. It's too early to call, and I'm not sure whether last night's drama will have an impact on that. But in terms of the chair's understanding, she was considering this to be a draft text.
Okay. There's optimistic. Then we've been hearing rumours that maybe it will be a non-paper, but perhaps there's scope for it to be a solid negotiating text. And of course, it's not simply the UNFCCC process that's important here. We've got other important milestones in between now and Cancun. Do you want to just kind of run through for us what should our viewers be looking out for over the next few months?
Well, soon after Bonn, we have the G20 happening in Canada. Lots of NGOs have been lobbying to have climate finance on that agenda. It seems as if the Canadians have not been too forthcoming and wouldn't want that to be on the agenda, but we will continue to lobby for it. You can't have a situation where, you've had in previous rounds of the G20 resolutions on the issue and then not deal with it. There's been commitments by a number of the G20 countries themselves, pledges for finance, the kind of early finance, fast start finance, and long-term finance pledges. And they need to talk about how they're going to be mobilizing that and how it's actually going to be disbursed, especially the fast start finance, the 30 billion until 2012. So they would have to start coming out with some of those concrete resolutions already in this G20.
And you mentioned there that Canada hasn't been particularly responsive to calls for climate to be, an important part of the agenda. You're nonetheless hopeful that some of these issues will be resolved in this context?
Well, if they do not want it on the agenda and they're hosting the G20, it's going to take a bit of other lobbying to do. I think it's important. For example, I would think that we would need to lobby some of the key emerging economies to have this on the agenda, because of course it's in their interest to do so. And they also have to represent and reflect the needs of vulnerable countries and people. So I hope that we can get some kind of push from other quarters to insert this into the agenda.
So the G20 might be a venue for making progress on finance, and then where do we move from there?
Well, then we get into the August Bonn session and what we'd really like to see there, if this is agreed to as a negotiating text out of this session, is that the negotiators get into line-by-line negotiation. Let's just get through the text. Let us start removing those brackets. Let us reach agreement. And I think there are some areas that potentially could be moved along already. So, for example, I think there's been some movement on the adaptation issue, and they're talking about the different institutional arrangements of the fund and the fund board. So I think, there could be consensus on that body of work under adaptation, and that could be in a state of readiness to just agree in Cancun. I believe, it's my understanding also, that the red issue could be resolved. And so if we can see parties moving some key pieces of an overall agreement already by the time they reach Cancun, that would be a good basis for getting some building blocks of an overall agreement. Not necessarily in Cancun, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but at least some of the key building blocks that can create the momentum for an overall agreement.
So essentially what they're looking for is to get kind of certain components of this text agreed so that it's not controversial in Cancun. Is that essentially it? And then people can check them off and basically agree them in Cancun. And so after Bonn, then we move to China, and presumably that will be a similar process there?
Yeah, the October session in China would have to carry on with that negotiation. So they'd have to get into absolute negotiation mode, where they look at compromises and not continue with the kind of things that they've been doing here, where everybody just dig their heels in and they're not willing to compromise. And so they really have to get into that mode, both in August and in China, and deepen the work so that really, by the time you reach Cancun, you need to be able to have ticked off those things, as you said. You need to have set aside those things that were easier to resolve and then get to the crunch issues quickly. And my sense is, quite frankly, that we're not going to get the finalized degree. We'd love to be able to get the fair, ambitious and binding deal in Cancun. I think we also need to have another fallback position that says, let us try and get as much in Cancun that lays the basis for further finalization towards South Africa, COP17 in South Africa. And we need to, just in terms of the time frames, be able to finalize that agreement by COP17, because if you look at it, 2012 is looming ahead. And so we would need, you don't want to have a vacuum between the first commitment period of Kyoto and then the second commitment period.